the answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Now that we're on the other side of 2 weeks of the Schiff hearings on impeachment, what do we have? Well, according to Adam Schiff and Meet the Press, we have overwhelming evidence. And he doesn't want to preordain moving forward with articles of impeachment because he doesn't want to step on Pelosi's toes, but he certainly wants us to go there.
So even as we compile this report, even as we submit evidence to the Judiciary Committee, we're going to continue with our investigation. But we are not going to let the administration stonewalling us stop us. And if people are acknowledging, and I think they're quite right, that the evidence is overwhelming, then you have to ask, what more would be necessary to show Republicans? Indeed, is there anything that could move Republicans?
Well, let me give you one example.
They'll do their duty.
You'd also have to ask who those people are specifically that find the evidence overwhelming. Now, on the other side of this, the side that Democrats don't want to talk about, the Joe Biden, the courtship of Hunter's father, storyline. Joe is just beside himself. I haven't seen such a poignant breakup since Jennifer Aniston and Vince Vaughn. Joe Biden and Lindsey Graham.
Let me ask you, because Lindsey Graham now, who you've worked with, who was a friend, who I know there's video of him saying, oh, you are the nicest person he's ever met, you're the greatest man, and now he's asking the State Department for documents for you and your son. What do you say to Lindsey Graham and folks like him?
They're asking Lindsey Graham. They have him under their thumb right now.
It's being held hostage.
He knows if he comes out against Trump, he's got a real tough road for re-election. Number one. I am disappointed, and quite frankly, I'm angered by the fact he knows me. He knows my son. He knows there's nothing to this.
Nothing to it.
Trump is now essentially holding power over him that even the Ukrainians wouldn't yield to. The Ukrainians would not yield to, quote, investigate Biden, because there's nothing to investigate about Biden or his son. And Lindsey is about to go down in a way that I think he's going to regret his whole life.
What do you say to him?
I say, Lindsey,
Come home, baby.
What happened?
Come home, baby. It's going to be different this time.
By what you're doing for you. I mean, my Lord.
My Lord, indeed. And by the way, I do appreciate that Joe Biden conceded there were no investigations, so thus no quid pro quo. But that notwithstanding, reviewing the last 2 weeks that were in the context of all of the reporting, we're pleased to be joined by John Solomon, award-winning investigative journalist who's been on this Ukraine matter for years in advance of it bubbling up to being the basis for impeaching President Trump. John, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
I got to be with you guys.
Before we get to all this impeachment and Ukraine business, I got to ask you, it's sort of a remarkable thing, Michael Bloomberg entering the presidential race this weekend and announcing that Bloomberg News won't do any investigative reporting on Democratic presidential candidates, of course, including him, but will continue to investigate President Trump. So, I mean, who needs a Fusion GPS when you have Bloomberg News?
Listen, the state of the media is very troubling to me, and it's part of the reason why I'm stepping aside and starting my own media company in a couple of weeks, because we used to speak with a neutral voice. We used to agree there were one set of facts and then let people make up their mind. Today, we don't speak with a neutral voice at all. We pick sides, we pick winners, we pick losers, we create us and them, and we cherry-pick facts and we leave other facts out. You can see this even in the impeachment coverage. And so the Bloomberg trend isn't surprising. It's just part of a larger trend of what's wrong with the news media today.
So what was the biggest point of contention for you during these impeachment inquiries?
Well, personally, I watched a lot of these State Department and NSA witnesses come out and say, John Solomon's stories were all wrong. Mm-hmm. They don't cite a fact. And then over the next 8 hours, as questioning and cross-examination came along, they'd say, oh, no, that fact is right, that fact's right, that's fact right. And all the way through, they would confirm my story after creating a blanket sweeping claim that my stories were wrong. It's very frustrating to see that. And it goes to the larger issue of this sort of new tactic in information warfare, right, which is declare something wrong, don't be held to account, and find out what it is. And then later on when you're questioned, well, you might actually acknowledge it was right. And for me, it was frustrating, and not just personally, but it's bad for the American people when false storylines are perpetrated by our government and by the news media. And listen, there are good questions on the Trump side. There are good questions on the Biden side. the media refuses to look at the Biden side.
Yeah, let's start on the Biden side because that is, as you say, an area that the media, the Beltway media, doesn't want to look at. Give us the Reader's Digest version of the timeline of the Biden adventure in Ukraine, and that, frankly, has now metastasized into a Biden venture in China, to a Biden venture with the federal loan program in 2009. So everywhere Hunter is, Joe is sure to follow to make sure he's getting some action from the work that's being done. But let's just stick on Ukraine because this is where you've really been on the nut for several years, and give us the timeline and why this is relevant.
Yeah, so I just put out about a 50 or 60 point timeline that really, I think, when people read it, they go, oh my gosh, now I get it. So 2014, there's the Maidan Revolution, the Russian favorable government in Ukraine thrown out. Joe Biden gets put in charge of all U.S.-Ukraine policy. He goes in April, and he talks to Ukraine officials, and he tells them, hey, guys, you need to ramp up your natural gas exploration, and you should use Americans to help you. That is April 2014. Within 4 weeks of that statement, both Hunter Biden's business associate, Devin Archer, and Hunter Biden are added to the board of the largest Ukrainian natural gas company called Burisma Holdings. So Joe Biden suggests the idea, and there is his son to get to catch the reward. A few years pass. In December of 15, it becomes clear to America because of a front-page New York Times story that this company, Burisma Holdings, is under criminal investigation in Ukraine for corruption. By the way, most of it, I think almost all of it, predating when Hunter joined the board. But he clearly was put on the board perhaps to insulate that investigation. So Joe Biden is now aware the chief prosecutor in Ukraine is overseeing an investigation of the company where his son works. That's not in dispute. February, that investigation escalates, and there's a raid on Hunter Biden's boss, the owner of Burisma Holdings. They raid his home, they take his documents, they take his possessions. It's clear that this investigation is moving forward at a rapid pace. And we know from the prosecutor they were making plans to interview Hunter Biden. What did he know about what the boss was covering up or had done wrong? It is at that point that Hunter Biden's legal team, the American legal team for Burisma, shows up at the State Department. We learned this because I got some FOIA documents recently. And they start pressuring the State Department. You need to make these allegations go away. This corruption talk needs to end. That is February 2016, the beginning of the Trump-Clinton election. Within a month, that's when Joe Biden intercedes and makes that threat and tells the Ukrainians, you don't get your $1 billion unless you fire that prosecutor. And Joe Biden fires that prosecutor. And over the next several months, the replacement prosecutor settles all those cases with a fine. So that's the timetable, and that's not in dispute. You can go and look at the timeline, and it's all documented very carefully.
Well, two things. One is George Kent, at minimum, testified during day one of the public hearing. Yeah, when Hunter was named to the Burisma board, that was something that was a concern to me because of the obvious appearance of a conflict of interest. It was
That's right.
It's a per se conflict of interest. And so what that would portend. But then a foreign service officer after officer, diplomat after diplomat, they sort of whitewash over the threat that Joe Biden made about loan guarantees, the demand for the removal of the prosecutor. They sort of are in the ends justify the means business, saying that prosecutor was corrupt, so it was okay. Whereas when Trump is in the ends justify the means business, it's a problem.
Yeah, no, it's interesting the ethical jumps they did on this. So here's what the law says: if you create the appearance of a conflict of interest, or you're involved in something that creates the appearance of a conflict of interest, you must step aside from the decision. So once Joe Biden knew the prosecutor he wanted to fire, it didn't matter if he had good reasons, bad reasons for firing the guy. The ethical thing to do, everyone agrees, is to step aside. That's what he should have done. And instead, he stayed involved in this decision. And, George Kent's testimony goes much further than just he saw a perception of a conflict of interest. He said he knew the company had such a corrupt reputation that in 2016, he put a stop to a plan where the State Department was going to do a joint project with Hunter Biden's company. He actually stopped it because he didn't think it was appropriate for the State Department to be in bed with such a bad company. So, and Ambassador Yovanovitch, she said she saw the conflict of interest. So the only person who can't see the conflict of interest, apparently, is Joe Biden.
And though that conflict of interest, those concerns with Burisma's dealings and the involvement of the vice president's son, those didn't rise to the level of running to the intelligence community's IG, filing a whistleblower report, none of those things. So, they're not, and this is at a time where you have the presidential administration making a decision on Ukrainian aid that was opposed by all of these career diplomats. I mean, with the exception of Fiona Hill, who was supportive of it before she's supportive of the Trump position.
That's right.
And then we're supposed to believe simultaneously that all of these diplomats have no partisan affiliation because they've served Republican and Democrat presidents.
Yeah, listen, I think after 2 weeks of hearings, you could see why the independent vote has gotten cold on the idea of impeachment. I think, one, it's confusing. You wonder what these bureaucrats are really up to. But more importantly, I think the American people are quick enough to understand there's a double standard here. If you're going to hold Trump to this account, why didn't you hold Biden to that account? And I think that the more this goes on, the more the people in the middle, the people who win elections and who matter every day in middle America, the more they're going to move away from these proceedings. And I think that's a great challenge for the Democrats right now. It may be why they haven't committed to articles of impeachment yet, because the politics are tricky for them now. They did not make the sort of case that swayed the American people. And in fact, if you look at some of the polling data, the American people kind of see a double standard going on here, and they're scratching their head trying to figure this out. So it's an interesting dynamic. It shows the American people are very wise.
And I have a quick question for you. In regards to Hunter Biden, what work did he do? Would he just go to a monthly board meeting, or because he didn't live in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's unclear, right? We know how much he got paid, right?
Yeah.
He and his firm was getting paid $166,666 a month from 2014, May of 2014 to at least December 2015, when I can see the records. That is a lot of money. It's $3.4 million that he and his business partner Devin Archer got. Now, when you look at the Burisma books, it calls it consulting payments, which is very unusual. You don't normally pay a consulting payment to a board member. So it's really kind of unclear what they did, but they certainly were paid very handsomely.
Right, and it's not like it was legal work where he's billing hourly either, clearly, because of, as you said, how it was characterized. With respect to now the Dems and going after Trump, every star witness, every witness, of course, was a star witness, but even when you got to the people that actually had been on the call and communicated with President Trump at least once in their lives, which was about half of the field, you had like Gordon Sondland, the ambassador to the EU, saying things that were contradictory one breath to the next. So, for example, he makes this declarative statement, there was a quid pro quo and everybody knew it, and then everybody rushes to say it's game over, Trump should resign by the end of business today. And then later, in the back and forth, he says there's not one person on the planet that ever told him there was a quid pro quo that needed to be enforced. So which is it?
Yeah, well, I think if you interpreted Sondland's testimony, this is what it might sound like to an average person. There was a quid pro quo. I created it because I presume that's what the president wanted, but I never checked with the president. Then when I checked with the president, I found out he didn't want a quid pro quo. I think that's his testimony, and that's what's so problematic for the Democratic case. Anyone who talked to the president so far who has testified has said, the president told me he wanted nothing, no quid pro quo. So they may have gone down that path on their own, making assumptions, but at the end of the day, no one can prove that the president ordered a quid pro quo. And I think that is the great challenge to this case. They built their entire case around the idea Trump ordered it, and at least at this moment, that evidence is not in record.
Well, and the other thing they do, right? So Adam Schiff and others can, see into the evil in Trump's heart, and they can also see into the fear in Zelensky's brain, right? Because Zelensky's public pronouncements are to be discarded. That he felt no pressure, there was no quid pro quo, there was no pressure. We didn't even know about the aid being withheld until the end of August. But what he's really doing is he can't risk offending President Trump and upsetting the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine. So that's how we're supposed to understand his pronouncements to the contrary.
Well, I think Adam Schiff had one of the great lines, if you go back to Russia, that I think it describes how Adam Schiff has conducted himself the last 3 years is after Mueller and after all the other people who had testified, they had not found collusion. Adam Schiff said something to the effect of, there's collusion there if you're willing to see it. Well, I guess you can be willing to see a pink elephant even if you're in a gray room. I just don't know. But I think at the end of the day, those sort of rhetorical leaps are what make people scratch their head in everyday America. They kind of see what's going on here, which is this is a very serious proceeding, but it's masqueraded, and it really is just covering a political game. And I think the American public can see through it. And the longer this goes on, absent some bombshell evidence, this is not going anywhere, at least in terms of public sentiment. It's fading very quickly.
He is John Solomon. He is an award-winning investigative journalist. JohnSolomonReports.com is where you can review some of his reporting, past and present, and we'll look forward to your next venture as well. John, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the time.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Attention maintenance coordinators. Fans are a vital part of your business's building or factory. You've got to keep the air moving. But when they break down or need service, who can you call? Vans Industrial repair all types of fans, from small wall fans to large air movers.
Hi, I'm Dave Van Camp, president of Vans Industrial. Fan repair is one of many services that Vans offers. If you have a fan with a damaged shaft, bearing, impeller, or housing, we can help. And if you need a new fan, we handle all major brands and can provide engineering assistance